Hello, I'm John David Ebert, and welcome to class number 7 in our Understanding Contemporary Art. Last time we were talking about Mark Rothko, the first half of his oeuvre. This time I want to talk about the rest of it. And we had seen that what Rothko had done was to essentially create a cosmos made out of self-luminous light forms, these pulsing, radiant, elementary units of being. And what I want to do now is pick up his work with 1957 here with this painting, Black on Red, of 1957, where for the first time now, an interesting new element begins to enter his work, an element of blackening. Black begins to come into his paintings during this period, and it begins to proliferate. There are a lot of blacks and maroons, black on red, red on maroon, a whole bunch of them from 1957. And this element of blackening, and there are a lot of earth tone colors, dark browns and so forth, that begin to come in at this time, essentially represents the element of materiality. These are earth tones, in other words, that had been missing from his self-luminous cosmos of pure light forms. So now he begins to come up with a kind of anti-cosmos that's an anti-universe that is in direct opposition to his previous universe. And this becomes more clear, I think, when we look at the murals that he did for Philip Johnson's Four Seasons restaurant in New York in 1959. This is red on maroon. And what we see here is a totally different kind of cosmology. It's very much opposed to the previous cosmology that he'd come up with, beginning with the multiforms from 46 all the way down through 1954. Here we see that the blackening element, which essentially portends what Heidegger would term the nothing is opposed to being. Being is represented in Rothko by the pulsing light units, but the nothing now begins to assert itself and to enter in an invasive way into his cosmos, and it begins to form the borders for all of these compositions, these murals that he did, which proved to be abortive murals. He decided to pull out at the last minute. He didn't want his work degraded to the level of muzak. But here we see that there's a central, what he's painting here is a central semiotic vacancy that is at the heart of the center of Western being in the post-metaphysical age. Now, during the metaphysical age, this kind of central center of a composition would have been occupied, as in this case, the painting here of Petrus Christus's Madonna on a dried tree of 1465, where we can see that she is framed by a tree that also doubles as a metaphor for Christ's crown of thorns, but that there isn't a semiotic vacancy here at the center. The center is occupied by what's known in philosophy as a transcendental signified, that is to say, an ultimate term of reference of the Madonna here. In other words, an iconotype. And the paintings of the metaphysical age would be the central compositions, the central parts of them would be not semiotic vacancies at all, because all forms of meaning were referred to these ultimate signifieds, the iconotypes of the crucifixion, the Last Supper, the Madonna, and so forth. And so when we go back to these, the central semiotic vacancies of the works then that Rothko is doing here for these Seagram murals, here we have black on maroon from the same period, where we have two semiotic vacancies that are at the center here. And then in red on maroon from this same group, we see another semiotic vacancy surrounded by red. This is the semiotic vacancy that is at the heart of the West's understanding of being now in the post-metaphysical age, when all the transcendental signifieds have been pulled apart, deconstructed, anathematized, and gotten rid of. Now there is only an empty center. This is what Derrida called in his essay in one of his famous essays in Writing a Différance, the empty center at the heart of the West's understanding of being. It's now empty. There's a quest now that's beginning in art for new signifieds to fill that center. And that the intrusive element of the blackening does begin to become a threat to Rothko. We can see in the murals that he did for the Harvard Chapel, the Harvard murals of 1962, in the fact that he begins to create a sort of chains or a polymerization of these black Stonehenge-like monolithic structures. He begins to connect them together into chains and create polymers. And of course, polymers are created in evolution, like the bilayers that are created by cells at the start of evolution, when there's an attempt to recognize self versus other. And so Pollock's, or rather Rothko's defense mechanisms are up here now. He is beginning to sense the threat that the nothing poses to his cosmos of being. And indeed, the nothing was described by Heidegger as that which is opposed to being and is a threat to being, because the nothing introduces an oscillation into the heart of being and threatens to destabilize it. After all, everything that is will one day not be. And so the nothing is the counter concept to being, and it enters into Rothko's work, and it slowly, over time, begins to destabilize his entire cosmos and bring all the signifiers in it, including the semiotic vacancies, which are absent of signifiers, down the drain. And this becomes especially clear in the Rothko Chapel that he did between 1964 and 1967. Here we see the Rothko Chapel has this kind of Zen-like simplicity about it, but now note that the nothing, the black, has completely permeated all of his canvases and totally taken them over, to the point that the nothing has won. In the battle of the struggle that is evident in Rothko's work between being and nothing, the nothing has won, as we see here in these completely black canvases that are shorn of all signifiers and all semiotics whatsoever. They're total semiotic vacancies. Whereas the semiotic vacancies that he had been painting for the Seagram murals were essentially the semiotic vacancies at the heart of the West, where the iconotypes had been dismantled and deconstructed and were pictured as no longer being there. Here, the semiotic vacancies that he paints in these in the Rothko Chapel for the Dimentals is essentially the semiotic vacancy of the absence of his own cosmology. His entire cosmology has gone down the drain here, and he's representing the semiotic vacancy of that, rather than just the West's central heart of absent being, the absent center at the heart of the West understanding of being. And here's the central triptych from that chapel from 64 and 67, and the complete victory of the nothing over being. But now, in the late 60s, Rothko had an aneurysm that nearly killed him, but he recovered, and the struggle of the nothing, or the struggle of being against the nothing, begins to reassert itself in his final series of canvases, which are acrylics, blacks on grays, and here is one of them. This is his black on gray from 1969 to 70, in which being once more now begins to reassert itself against the nothing, and we see the white representative being beginning to push back against the nothing and to push against it. And for one moment they're in perfect equilibrium. We see the being and the nothing in a state of total perfect equilibrium. And this series was painted just before Rothko committed suicide in 1970 by slicing into his arms with razor blades at the kitchen sink. So this was his final statement. He refused to completely allow the nothing to totally engulf and swallow his cosmos. And it's interesting how it ends with this sort of Manichaean struggle of the powers of light against the powers of darkness. Now, that brings us to the conclusion of our first week. And I just briefly here want to recap our first week. We began with an introduction to modernism. And note there that we started with the distinction between perspectival painting, the painting of the metaphysical age that began with the discovery of perspectival space in the 15th century, and which extended all the way down to the Impressionist painters, in which space is three-dimensional and in which there is a single point of view from a single subject. This is the age of absolute subjects confronting absolute objects. To modernist art, which began to dismantle perspective and to bring in multiple points of view. Multiple points of view, multiple times, multiple spaces, multiple temporalities, all brought together to create the single hyperdimensional object, which is space-free and time-free. And that is the essence that we discovered was the primary achievement of modernism. Then we moved on with Marcel Duchamp with his discovery of the ready-made, in opposition to the highly theoretical object of modernism, which is a purely theoretical object beheld only by the mind. And not visible to the physical eyes. Marcel Duchamp brings in the banal object, the ready-made, the snow shovel, that brings in the concrete commonplace object that he draws a phase space around, dismantles it by pulling it free from its functioning in the Zuhandenheit of the flow of things, puts it into a Vorhandenheit mode by putting it into the museum, putting a phase space around it, and putting it into a theoretical mode, where now it has become deworlded. A lot of contemporary art, and this is a complaint made by Jean Baudrillard in his book on the conspiracy of art, a lot of contemporary art is composed of objects and things that have been ruptured from their normal functioning. We will later see Joseph Beuys rupturing, pianos by wrapping them in felt, or he'll take a record and paint it red so that it can't be played, and he'll create a special kind of needle out of a bone. And this is his way of dismantling and rupturing the normal functioning of normal banal objects. So a lot of contemporary art under the influence of Duchamp's ready-mades does consist in rupturing the normal average everyday functioning of an object and dismantling its ability to function in the Zuhandenheit flow of things and putting it into the museum. And so Baudrillard's complaint was too much of contemporary art just ends up with this midden heap, this junk heap of broken things that have simply had their functions ruptured, and that is called art. And so Baudrillard, I don't think, was too fond of contemporary art for the most part. Then we moved on with Jackson Pollock, as we have seen, with his creation of, in 1947, the great drip paintings, where he moved out, he liquefied forms and dissolved them into his version of liquid modernity as the great drip paintings. And then after Jackson Pollock, we are concluding here with Mark Rothko, and we saw with his multiforms in 1946, and then the cosmos of self-luminous squares and rectangles that he created around 1949, 50, down to 54. His creation of the universe of self-luminous forms, in which abstract expressionism culminates here in a kind of Zen-like aniconism that eliminates all iconology, and we're left with the semiotic vacancies at the heart of Western being with his paintings that he did for Philip Johnson's Four Seasons restaurant, the Seagram murals as they're known, and his final statement of the collision between being and nothing at the end of his art. That brings us down to the end of class number 7, and that is the full week of the first unit of our course in understanding art. And next week we will shift modes and look at pop art.